Welcome everybody to our last BASF lecture in our series this academic year. And it is my particular pleasure to welcome as our guest speaker, Dr. Peter Verovšek, lecturer in politics at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Verovšek is an acclaimed expert on the function of the public intellectual in the German lands and in this country, most notably in connection with his studies on Jürgen Habermas. He is certainly a acclaimed Habermas expert, and he has also written extensively on the function of memory in the context of European culture and what memory does or does not do for the future of Europe. This is very much also the title of his monograph published in 2020. And in addition to that, it is very much the engaged citizen that is in the forefront of his concern. And this, of course, is also the very title of his paper tonight, to which we all look forward to: Direct Engagement or Discursive Impact, Public Philosophy in the United Kingdom and Germany. Dr. Verovšek is, as it were, widely traveled. He held very prestigious fellowships. He was a lecturer at Harvard for some time, but also a fellow at the prestigious Bad Homburg Institute for Advanced Study. He was in Lausanne in connection with the Jean Monnet outfit there. And he was also a fellow in the Excellence Cluster in Frankfurt at the Goethe University. So we are delighted that you are with us, Peter, and we look forward to your talk immensely. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rüdiger, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me to present some of my work as part of this lecture series. It's a real honor to be here with you tonight and to be included with the other speakers. I'd also like to thank Andrew Hines and Kim, Jana, Rochelle for all the technical support. And also sort of the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations more generally. And I'm really excited to be here tonight and to be able to share some of my reflections from my new project on public philosophy, which focuses in particular on the role of public intellectuals in modern democratic life with you tonight. So although it focuses on the governing of human communities, the origins of legitimacy, the nature of justice, and other basic questions of politics and political life, the relationship between political philosophy and public policy has always been fraught. On the one hand, in light of its status as an academic discipline, many modern political theorists follow Max Weber in arguing that today, quote, scientifically pleading for practical and interested stands is meaningless in principle, because the various value spheres of the world stand in irreconcilable conflict with each other, unquote. On the other hand, since it's usually classified as a branch of practical and not theoretical philosophy, it seems natural to think that political theory should be able to provide us with concrete political guidance. In fact, the idea that it is an effective source of orientation or a guide to action was the default position for much of the history of modern political thought. While today it may seem somewhat strange for an academic or public philosopher, more specifically, to enter into the political fray, few of the major thinkers in the canon before the late 18th or early 19th century was a cloistered scholar or university professor detached from the real world of politics. While none of the thinkers of the canon attempted to rule as Socratic philosopher kings, most were directly engaged in the politics of their time. For example, Plato made at least 3 trips to Sicily to advise the tyrants of Syracuse. Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, a similar role to that held by Thomas Hobbes. who served as a tutor to the exiled royal court during the English Civil War. Niccolò Machiavelli spent many years in Florence as part of the Foreign Service and was even an advisor to the ruling Medici family. And John Stuart Mill had a career as a colonial administrator for the semi-sovereign East India Company, and for a time was even responsible for its foreign relations with the princely states. However, over the course of the 19th century, political thinkers gradually moved away from this traditional desire to influence public policy more directly by acting as advisors or within government proper. In large part, this was due to the creation of the modern university, which allowed political philosophers to pursue what previously would have been mere avocations as a paid profession. This development not only enabled political philosophers to retreat from actual politics, it also allowed them to ignore questions of politics entirely, if they so desired. In recent years, however, political theory has undergone what has often been referred to as an applied turn, with a growing consensus that political philosophers should have socio-political ambitions for their work. Unfortunately, there is no discernible consensus on how to balance truth-seeking and democratic responsiveness in doing so. On the contrary, this issue has led to a lot of high-profile polemics and disputes. Rather than focusing on those debates themselves, given the forum in which I'm speaking tonight, I will instead dedicate my attention to how these disagreements play themselves out in the practice of public philosophy in the United Kingdom and the Federal Republic of Germany. Undoubtedly, one of the most important factors is the approach to philosophy that is most prevalent within the educational system of each of these states. Generally speaking, the UK is dominated by the analytic approach, which stresses the virtues of conceptual and normative clarity. In this context, the philosopher is more likely to engage in politics directly, since this tradition fosters the belief that political philosophers are specially equipped to help their fellow citizens make their political choices. By contrast, Germany and the rest of Europe is dominated by so-called continental philosophy. While this geographic marker isn't always the most helpful, there are also analytic philosophers in Germany and continental philosophers in the UK. Political theorists working within this more literary, contextual philosophical tradition focus more on the practices of reasoning as embedded in broader social, economic, and cultural structures. As a result, they tend to favor more indirect, critical forms of engagement that function through the broader public sphere. In my talk tonight, I will briefly reflect on how these differences between analytic and continental thought affect how public philosophy is practiced. I then turn to how these differences play out in the UK and the Federal Republic. In examining how the analytic approach in Britain fosters direct engagements with politicians and the policy process, I will highlight what this relationship means for kind of the way that the university system interacts with political life. And in doing so, I'm going to focus in particular on what is probably the most politically important degree in the UK, the Oxford Politics, Philosophy and Economics degree, or PPE. Turning my attention then to Germany, I will highlight how continental philosophers there are more inclined to apply their theoretical insights indirectly, seeking to influence broader societal discourses as public intellectuals. I will concretize these reflections using the example of Jürgen Habermas, the foremost philosopher and public intellectual of post-war West Germany. On the basis of this presentation, I will conclude that the continental approach of contributing to debates in the public sphere is more respectful of democratic norms and of the ideal of popular participation, since it does not seek to gain influence behind closed doors by using what is sometimes referred to as privilege connected to public service. In other words, sort of status. But instead respects the equality of all citizens as potential participants in public discourse. I will also briefly argue that this mediated, indirect form of public philosophy has the added advantage of allowing political theorists to apply their knowledge within the public sphere without undermining their status as academic researchers, whose philosophy is oriented to truth operating within certain disciplinary norms. So I will start by reflecting on the differences between the two major forms of philosophy practiced in the UK and Germany, and how these traditions affect sort of the way that analytic and continental philosophers tend to approach public philosophy or sort of politics more generally. At the most basic level, analytic and continental philosophy differ in both the questions they ask and how they seek to answer them. As the name suggests, the analytic approach is identified by its commitment to rigor and precision. On this understanding, the goal of philosophy is the analysis of the structure of thought, and it argues that the only proper way or proper method for achieving this aim consists in the analysis of language. As a result, analytic philosophy has long had ambitions to something like scientific status. With its readily applicable conceptual tools, it stands alongside other disciplines, seeing itself as supporting them with its expertise in the clarification of questions and the necessary logical presuppositions of possible answers to them. Peter Strawson, in describing analytic philosophy, makes the following comparison. Quote, just as the modern grammarian labors to produce a systematic account of the structure of rules which we effortlessly observe in speaking grammatically, so the philosopher labors to produce a systematic account of the general conceptual structure of which our daily practice shows us to have a tacit and unconscious mastery, unquote. By contrast, while continental philosophy is also interested in language, it does not seek to uncover existing intuitions or unconscious knowledge. Far from assuming that human beings merely need to systematize what they already implicitly comprehend, continental philosophy instead examines how language, practices, and everyday understandings of the world reveal deep, fundamental problems and inconsistencies. As a result, the themes of cultural critique, concern with the background conditions of inquiry, and more generally what we might refer to as the fall of the self, run through the writings of most continental thinkers. Given that this approach is closer to the humanities than to the natural sciences, the continental approach does not provide clear answers to precise questions. Instead, it problematizes existing ideas and generates new, presumably more illuminating, ways of conceptualizing problems. The distinction between these two forms of philosophy can perhaps best be understood by their different structural problematics. While analytic thinkers are driven by what David Owen refers to as the guidance problem, continental thinkers are motivated by the problem of critique. Thus, whereas analytic philosophy is focused on generating reasons that are oriented to the issue of articulating norms of justice and legitimacy that guide political judgments and intuitions about forms of conduct, continental political philosophy is oriented to critically assessing the practices of reasoning that characterize our social and political institutions and forms of conduct. So these basic methodological differences shape not only how political philosophers think about what they can bring to public policy and broader debates, but also how they go about doing so. On the one hand, the analytically inclined tend to favor direct engagement with politics since they proceed from the assumption that political philosophy is made for the analysis of public policy, exploring foundational values and consolidating them into theories and prototypical policies that could, with reasonable adjustment, fit practical needs to real problems and to improve our lives. They are therefore more likely to intervene as advisors to governments, members of think tanks, members of commissions, and policy communities that provide policy recommendations to elected officials. In these kinds of capacities, they're able to assist in the policymaking process by putting their philosophical tools to use. By contrast, continental political theorists favor more indirect, critical engagement with social and political life because they are more interested in the stakes and conditions of knowledge, and thus in laying bare the non-rational factors that condition what we do and how we think. Insofar as they choose to enter into public debate, they do so from the outside by taking on the role of the public intellectual. In this way, they follow in the footsteps of Immanuel Kant, who saw it as his duty, quote, as a man of learning addressing the entire reading public, to publicly voice his thoughts on the impropriety or even injustice of politics, unquote. And that comes from Kant's very famous essay on what is enlightenment. These differences play themselves out very clearly in the way that political philosophers engage with politics in the UK and in Germany. We'll now turn to a brief overview of the UK before moving on to Germany. As I've already noted, the analytic approach dominates British philosophy. As a result, in the words of John Donne, its practitioners are inclined to believe that, quote, the purpose of political theory is to diagnose practical predicaments and to show us how best to confront them, unquote. Given their training in the abstract analysis of problems, they argue that their tools are applicable to a broad range of issues, including public safety, healthcare, sustainability, criminal punishment, etc. Despite their lack of specialized knowledge or expertise in any of these fields, analytic philosophers still argue that they have much to offer public policy. Despite a number of internal disagreements about how to go about practicing public philosophy that I cannot go into in the time available to me here, this analytic desire for political theory to contribute to real politics influences how public philosophy functions. More specifically, the link between academic philosophy and public policy in the UK is to a large extent defined by the highly centralized, elitist nature of higher education in Britain. As John Campbell notes, quote, whatever the competing academic claims of Cambridge, it is overwhelmingly from Oxford that the governing elite has reproduced itself, generation after generation, unquote. More specifically, since its foundation in 1920, the philosophy, politics, and economics, or PPE degree there, has emerged as the course of choice for aspiring politicians in the UK. It is not an accident that one of the early tutors of PPE, Benjamin Jowett, sought to use this degree program to link university education to public service, and admittedly even aspired to, quote, govern the world, unquote, through his students. PPE has largely succeeded in this goal, as a surprising number of its graduates have become government ministers or even prime minister. By my count, at least, there are currently 35 PPE graduates in the House of Commons. And obviously there are even many more graduates of Oxford in that group. And in fact, Oxford graduates make up a total of 50% of ministers and 28% of MPs. So it's quite amazing what a large percentage of the governing elite in the UK comes from Oxford, and more specifically from PPE. This close connection between PPE and Westminster has important implications for how philosophers, particularly those connected to this degree program, are able to influence public life. The fact that so many of their former students hold public office means that they are able to exert that influence directly and behind the scenes. This occurs both formally, as Oxford dons are often the first people asked to sit on government commissions and advisory panels, and also informally, as many PPEists turn to their erstwhile tutors for conversation and advice. In a sign of how well Jowett's aspirations for governing through his students has turned out, the Baron Roy Jenkins, who served as an MP a number of times for a number of different parties in the latter half of the 20th century, points out, many, quote, many Oxford tutors enjoyed advertising their power by arranging for their tutorials to be interrupted by telephone calls from famous politicians, unquote. And I assume that this probably happened to him as well during his tutorials. So one might think that such a development would lead to good evidence-based public policy. In some cases, that may be the case. However, it's also problematic given some of the ways the PPE degree is structured. For example, instead of leading to careful considerations of the concrete issues at hand, the debate about the implications of change and the building of consensus about what should be done, none other than Dominic Cummings has noted and has excoriated PPE for encouraging its graduates to, quote, fool themselves and spread bad ideas with lots of confidence and bluffing, unquote. And I'm sure we can all think of examples of this. This is actually something that's talked about by a lot of former PPE students, and it's a standard critique of PPE in the sense that PPE is a very broad degree that encourages its students in very short essays to sort of bluff and sort of show expertise, even though ultimately their knowledge is relatively superficial. So rather than engaging with experts who can bring specialized knowledge to bear on the matter at hand, this kind of approach encourages people to impose their pre-existing ideas with sort of good arguments, or at least good rhetorical arguments, even if there may be fundamental problems that underlie them. Obviously, PPE cannot be taken to represent all public philosophy in the UK. However, it is clear that the highly centralized, elitist educational and political system in Britain, which are closely linked together, encourage political theorists to be genuine participants in public debate in their capacity as philosophers. This approach differs sharply from the way that political theorists tend to engage with politics in Germany. So in contrast to the analytic approach that dominates the UK, philosophy in Germany is defined by the continental tradition. Unlike analytics, practitioners of the continental approach prefer to engage with politics indirectly by writing letters to newspapers, appearing in the media, setting up pressure groups, etc. There are a number of different reasons that explain this difference. To start, continental social and political theorists believe that their lack of specialized knowledge disqualifies them from making expert judgments about what should be done. Instead, they argue that political theorists can play a role in politics and in political debate as a public intellectual, that is, as a person who has devoted his or her life to thinking in general terms about the affairs of the world and the broader context of things. And largely, right, this is a kind of problematizing function, not a kind of guidance function in the way that would be for analytics. So it's a function that tries to problematize certain proposals or certain dominant ideas and show their blind spots. In addition to this more constrained understanding of what theory can accomplish or what philosophy can accomplish, continental philosophers also prefer to act as public intellectuals due to their different understanding of the relationship between theory and practice. Whereas analytics tend to argue that they can take on the role of the philosopher investigator, continental philosophers instead believe that the academic search for truth must remain separate from social and political interventions. In part, this is because they fear their kind of mutual corruption and contamination. In part, it's also because sort of political life is not governed simply by logical relations or anything like that, but in many ways by contingency and by relationships and by other things that sort of theory or philosophy, which tends to operate at a high level of abstraction, simply cannot take into account. Differences in the respective systems of higher education in the UK and Germany also play an important role. I briefly highlighted before and talked about the UK, the way that the kind of central place of the Oxford PPE degree gives public philosophers an avenue into public policy through their former students serving in government. While other countries have educational institutions that play similar roles in educating the ruling class, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, or the École Normale Supérieure sort of spring to mind as examples. The highly egalitarian university system in Germany has not allowed for the development of an equivalent degree program that would allow its teachers to govern the world through their former students, as Jowett sought to do with PPE. In order to explore how continental political philosophy relates to political practice in Germany, I will focus on the work of Jürgen Habermas as a kind of example. His work is relevant not only because he is one of the most important, if not the most important, philosopher of the post-war era, but also because he has engaged extensively in public debates, acting as an engaged public intellectual in the same political public sphere that he theorized as a philosopher. Instead of aiming for direct influence on public policy, Habermas has instead sought to fuel political transformation by raising the consciousness of the public regarding certain important issues, in his words, quote, by broadening the spectrum of relevant arguments in an attempt to improve the lamentable level of public debate, unquote. This indirect, mediated approach to public philosophy reflects Habermas's relatively constrained view of what theory can accomplish. As an institutionalized profession pursued within the university, Habermas notes that philosophy is engaged in the search for, quote, scientific truth as a form of truth which can be defined only in terms of methodological research, unquote. Moreover, he notes that to get anything out of theoretical work, you have to follow it for its own sake, not with political goals in mind. While the theorist may feel the temptation to move directly from ideals to their realization, Habermas argues that, quote, the question of whether a specific practice advances a certain goal cannot be decided beforehand within the context of even the most complex theory, unquote. This conception of philosophy has important implications for how political theory can be applied to politics. Unlike analytic public philosophers, who argue that political theory can, and in some cases perhaps even must, have direct implications for discussions of the practicalities of political action and choice, Habermas instead argues that the academic search for truth must remain separate from the social and practical interventions of the theorist in their role as a public intellectual. For Habermas, the most important task of a public intellectual in the modern, increasingly mediatized public sphere that is increasingly governed by economic concerns is to combat the manipulation of democratic discourse by spin doctors, interest groups, political parties, and other economic interests, which lead to what he calls a Neutralisierung der Staatsbürger, so a neutralization of citizens. Since they do not depend on public appearances for their material livelihoods, he argues that in their role as public intellectuals, political philosophers retain the ability to speak truth to power, as they have what he calls, quote, the privilege of having to deal with public issues only as a sideline, unquote. And that sideline term, that's a standard English translation, but the word he's using there is Nebenberuf. So it's kind of an avocation or a side profession, or I guess in modern parlance, we call it a side hustle. Sort of not sort of your main profession or your anchor job. In this sense, public intellectuals on Habermas's conception are called to speak out, quote, when current events are threatening to spin out of control, but then promptly as an early warning system, unquote. In addition to being limited by his continental interpretation of the limits of philosophical knowledge and his strict separation of theory from practice, Habermas's view of public philosophy is also shaped by an important influence drawn from his personal experience as a German born during the interwar years. As a university student in the 1950s, and Habermas is born in 1929, Habermas was shocked to discover how many leading German legal and political theorists and philosophers had, including people like Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger, as well as his own doctoral supervisor, Dr. Vater Ernst Rottecker, had not only cooperated with the Nazi regime, but had also actively and publicly supported Adolf Hitler. Habermas interpreted this collaboration as evidence of what he calls, using the original French term, a déformation professionnelle, so a professional deformation, that led these thinkers to believe that they could use Hitler as a vehicle to realize their own theoretical ideals by leading the Führer, right? Den Führer führen. Following Theodor Adorno, who writes disdainfully of these elitist desires for authority, elitären Herrschaftswünsche, Habermas insists that German theorists have given up their right to act as teachers of the nation. While he does not want to give up on what he still sees as his Kantian, or as the Kantian duty of scholars to publicly adopt a critical stance against notions of scientific and technological progress dictated by the state, he became very wary of what he saw as the tendency of philosophers, particularly German philosophers, to be drawn into an intellectual romance with fascism via broader seduction of unreason. And those are sort of two very brief kind of quotations from him. Although Habermas still believes that philosophy has a role to play in the context of modern liberal political culture, he seeks to maintain a certain distance between philosophy and politics. In part, this is rooted in his more modest conception of philosophy, in part in his desire to separate theory from practice so that one does not sabotage the other, and then also sort of this his personal experiences and personal view of the very special position and very dangerous position that German philosophers have occupied in the past, and that has sort of tainted their work and their statements, at least when it comes to politics. So this brings me to my conclusion, if you will indulge me for a few more minutes. While it's obvious that there is much more to be said, the basic differences between how analytic philosophers in the UK and continental theorists in Germany seek to engage with real politics are hopefully clear. In particular, whereas the former favor connecting political reality and political theory through direct participation in the policy process, the latter prefer to operate at a distance, presenting their arguments in the public sphere as public intellectuals. In concluding my reflections, I want to argue that while analytic philosophy can still enhance public policy, it must also reckon with the danger that it will supplant or short-circuit the democratic process rather than contributing to it. This danger is particularly clear, I think, in Britain, where the pre-existing tendency for direct involvement is combined with privileged access to a relatively closed governing class, many of whom share similar backgrounds and who operate within the context of a political system that, unlike coalition governments in other countries, tends to give a lot of power to ministers because of majorities in parliament. In particular, the kind of training offered by PPE poses real threats to democratic legitimacy, insofar as it encourages philosophers and their students to treat their fellow citizens as passive objects whose eyes are to be opened by the theorist. While obviously not all PPE graduates take this view, it is a powerful tendency. For example, the Labour peer Stuart Wood, who took the PPE degree in the 1980s, notes that it is, quote, perfect training for the social engineer and feels like a course for people who are going to run the Raj in 1936, unquote. The fact that this degree was specifically designed to enable the academics, the dons, and philosophers teaching within it to govern the world through their former students only increases this worry. While neither PPE nor analytic philosophy are necessarily undemocratic in their approach, this preference for direct intervention in the policy process makes it easier for them to justify imposing their ideas without regard for public opinion when given access to power. This tendency is furthered by changing incentives within higher education in the UK. As universities and individual academics, like myself, have been pushed to compete for funding with each other at a time of decreased public support for research, the funding bodies and governmental assessment agencies and mechanisms, most notably the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, tasked with creating these competitive internal markets, are increasingly looking for researchers to show that their research has, quote, quantifiable real-world impacts, unquote. As a result, philosophers and other academics are being forced to choose between pursuing basic research for its own sake and the financial need to demonstrate impact on the broader society. Obviously, that financial need is tied very closely to sort of career ambitions and job security. The real problem with these trends is that they encourage philosophers and academics more generally to act behind the backs of their fellow citizens, seeking to influence public policy from within government through privileged access, especially in places like Oxford, where sort of former politicians often come and where many students become politicians. In this sense, the engaged philosopher must always be wary of giving into the desire to exert power. As Hannah Arendt points out in the German version of her essay, Truth and Politics, and for some reason this sentence, or this whole paragraph, is not in the English version, which is sort of the original, or at least the first version. Quote, the philosopher who seeks to engage in public policy is no longer a philosopher, but a politician. He no longer seeks truth, but power, unquote. Does this mean that analytic public philosophy is not viable, or that philosophers should refuse to participate directly in the policy process when asked to do so? Of course not. However, they must work hard to ensure that in practicing a form of engaged theory, they are doing so in a way that is focused on understanding the policy problem at hand and recognizing that they don't have the answer to everything. In this sense, and I can talk about this a little bit more in Q&A, Joe Wolfe, who is an analytic philosopher in the UK, has a very helpful distinction between applied and engaged philosophy, where applied sort of just seeks to take theory directly and apply it to public policy. And he talks about his own experiences as a younger academic when he sought to do this. And in the book, he actually encourages his fellow analytic philosophers to sort of avoid this and to focus on being engaged. In other words, not going in thinking they already know the answer. Insofar as continental philosophers acting as public intellectuals cannot exercise direct effects on public policy, but instead must convince their fellow citizens of the rightness of their ideas through free and open debate within the public sphere, it is clear that they are more likely to further the kinds of participatory forms of debate that our democracies increasingly need today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you ever so much, Peter, for this truly analytical view on the situation of the public intellectual as political philosopher and his or her influence on public policy. The participants will have the opportunity to ask questions via the chat. I think that is the idea, and we will read this out then to you once we have the first questions. I just wanted to, by way of introduction, I just wondered what you make of, shall we say, the more indirect influencing of public policy through, shall we say, a thinker like Karl Popper. I mean, Popper was famously inspirational for two politicians of very different denominations in political terms, namely Helmut Schmidt and Margaret Thatcher. And both regarded Popper as the proper transmitter, as it were, of a, in many ways, conservative reading of Immanuel Kant's philosophy. And I was wondering what your take would be on a figure like Popper, who obviously is very different in so many ways from Habermas, let alone from, shall we say, homegrown philosophers in this country, like, for argument's sake, Anthony Giddens and others. Is the role of someone like Karl Popper perhaps the even more intriguing one, who is in a sense present? His mind was present, to a certain extent is still present, but in many ways he was also absent. So this interplay of presence and absence of a political philosopher of this caliber, is this not also an intriguing, shall we say, figuration of a political thought in philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, Popper is a really, interesting figure more generally. And, you know, if we wanted to talk more about sort of his theories as such, we could have a whole interesting debate about sort of the way that Habermas's reading of Popper was part of the Methodenstreit in German sociology in the 1960s. But no, I mean, I think Popper is a really interesting example. And I think he's an interesting example, especially sort of given not only sort of the inspiration that he gave to many thinkers on kind of different sides of the political spectrum, but also in particular sort of the context in which his work was received, right? Especially the idea, right, of the open society in light of the Cold War, which I think really facilitated the spread of his ideas. But sort of, at least, I mean, I'm hardly an expert sort of on Popper himself, but to my knowledge, he didn't engage in politics very directly, right? His influence was mostly indirect through his books and through his writings. And I think that that's a very different kind of influence. And so I think that, you know, that's a kind of more similar version to kind of the way someone like Hayek was taken up, right? Where Margaret Thatcher famously threw down a copy of his book, right? It said, "This is what we believe." And so I think that's a very different kind of where you have politicians sort of reading or perhaps even having conversations with philosophers and being inspired by that. Two sort of philosophers kind of taking the kind of direct role within public policy that I'm talking about, or that I've critiqued to a certain extent in my talk today. So in that sense, right, I think the idea of presence and absence, I think, is really interesting. And particularly sort of the way that I think broader trends or sort of broader sort of moves within politics and the political context, changing political context, affects how certain philosophers' ideas are taken up at different times. I mean, another sort of, you know, there are many ways we could think about this, but it's really interesting where this relatively minor unknown figure, Gene Sharp, his work was taken up quite a lot during the Arab Spring, right? And even by the student protesters in Belgrade, right, who are part of the Otpor protests. And so you see kind of, and he's a wonderful theorist of nonviolence and sort of protest movements, but relatively unknown before he gets taken up in this way. So I think that's kind of a different avenue, but it's an avenue where I think those thinkers are really letting their theory speak, or where their theories are being taken up by politicians, sort of in the written form, which I think is perhaps, yes, yet another or a third form of public philosophy.
I mean, it's true, is it not, that we also have to wonder what constitutes a philosopher, what constitutes political philosophy today? I mean, in the past, we had sort of less problems. We could identify quite clearly what political philosophy really is about. Nowadays, I mean, the spectrum, I don't know, is certainly from Slavoj Žižek to what have you. And in a sense, the performativity of thought seems to play in our media age a highly significant part, which of course sometimes, not always admittedly, goes at the expense of philosophical depth, as it were. And of course, your quite understandable juxtaposition that you present us with, analytical philosophy on the one hand here, continental philosophy on the other. But of course, what is continental philosophy? Is continental philosophy by definition non-analytical? But I mean, you said that we do have obviously quite a number of thinkers in the German lands, for example, whom one would attribute this concept of analytical. But is there perhaps another quality that we could identify when we talk about continental philosophy? Is there something that is perhaps slightly more specific from your point of view?
Yeah, so I certainly think the point you made about sort of, I mean, what political philosophy is today, right, is obviously expanding, in the sense that, right, I mean, you know, if you just take the example of somebody like Jason Stanley, right, who wrote a book on ideology and a book on fascism. And he probably would not have been considered a sort of political philosopher previously, but the fact that these kind of problems of ideology and fascism are returning has sort of turned those themes into themes that have huge sort of political relevance, right? In the same way that sort of, I think a lot of people who are working on memory today, or memory in the philosophy of memory, might be called as political philosophers because issues of public memorialization, like which statues to take down, are increasingly becoming relevant, and sort of the kind of issues that I guess would formerly be considered more social theory or cultural theory are now have sort of political resonance, given the way that our politics has developed. So I think that that's certainly true, that political philosophy has probably never been broader than it is today, or at least not in the recent past. Your point about performativity and depth, I think, is also very well taken. And I think this is also sort of a difference in the way you see a lot of public intellectuals operate. And in part, I think it's a generational difference, right? Where you see someone like Habermas, or I mean, there's a very famous Slovenian public intellectual, even sort of philosopher, Mladen Dolar, who's fairly well known externally as well. And both of them argue that the kind of essential medium of the public intellectual is the written word, right? Precisely because it's not informed by appearances, by rhetorical flourishes, but it's just supposed to be about the kind of arguments you present in a kind of bare form, and it's supposed to encourage sort of deep reading and deep consideration. Whereas they're very critical of kind of the modern public sphere and the role that performativity plays, particularly once you move from the medium of the written word to radio and then ultimately to television. And I think sort of that's also where someone like Slavoj Žižek will come up, right? Where he will write The Guardian and other places, but his most powerful appearances, and the reason he's so famous, is in part because of the way he appears, the kind of accent he has, the tics he has. And I think that certainly plays a very large role. And I think there is a real worry on the part of a lot of sort of the older generation, that is taking away from the actual substance of the argumentation. So I definitely agree with that. And then in terms of sort of, yeah, continental philosophy, I mean, these terms are not always the most helpful. And I tried to sort of point to that, but I do think that kind of continental philosophy, it's much more literary, much more contextual, much more historical. Its arguments are usually presented, as building on kind of the shoulders of giants and building on kind of the tradition. And I think in that sense, I mean, I think for my purposes, the real difference is kind of sort of how you then engage. And obviously analytic philosophers could also engage in these kind of broader arguments, but they tend not to, I think largely because the broader arguments, they're usually concerns not narrowly about kind of the logic or the rigor of public argumentation, but they're concerns about the effect on broader society and culture. And I think it's not an accident that, I mean, I was talking about political philosophy as a kind of general term, but I think sort of political philosophy is a term that, or the idea of the label of political philosopher is more common, or is more commonly adopted by analytics. Whereas sort of continental philosophers interested in political theory will usually refer to themselves as social or political theorists, with that kind of broader understanding of what politics is. And so I think that's also important in this regard. But obviously, I mean, this is a huge, huge debate that I kind of just sought to sketch out in my argument today in order to sort of point to these two general tendencies in the practice of public philosophy.
Thank you. We have a comment from Matthew Scholl and from Astrid Köhler. First, Matthew, I think you were first. Did an interest in the possibilities of analytic philosophy as a route to power, which gathered pace in Germany perhaps between 1900 and 1933, result in the disaster of Nazi Germany and the Second World War, and does this contested history underpin the primacy of continental philosophy in modern and post-war Germany?
So no, I don't think so. I mean, I think sort of Germany, there are still, as Rudiger has already pointed out, analytic philosophers in Germany, and I don't think that has never been the dominant form of philosophy in Germany. So I don't think I don't think there's any kind of direct causation, right? I also sort of, if you think about, I mean, Martin Heidegger being probably the most famous example of a kind of definitely a continental philosopher who became a Nazi and sort of never actually renounced his membership or apologized for it. It's always unclear sort of to what extent he actually had any effect, right, on sort of the policies of the Nazi regime, right? I mean, I think sort of in Heidegger's case, he got caught up in the idea that sort of the Nazis were kind of going to bring meaning back into life by creating a kind of collective national Dasein. I think you might make an argument that the kind of legal theorist and philosopher Carl Schmitt did actually have a direct effect on Nazism, particularly sort of his readings of the emergency clause of the Weimar Constitution were really important in sort of the way that Hitler took power, sort of operating with using these emergency powers to basically destroy the democracy. But I don't think there's kind of any direct impact. I think my point about Habermas, and I think this sort of applies to other thinkers in post-war Germany as well, is that there was a real sense for those thinkers, and for people like Hannah Arendt as well, right, who famously knew Heidegger and even had an affair with him, where they really felt that the way that philosophy had been used, particularly, or misused, perhaps in the case of Nietzsche, by the Nazis, and the fact that so many German thinkers were caught up by, or sort of caught up by the Nazi movement, they really felt that this showed that philosophers of both the continental and the analytic tradition sort of had a weakness because they thought they were smart and they thought that they could kind of use politicians to achieve their ends. And there was a sense that that would always sort of end badly. And I think that in many ways really was important in shaping in the post-war world, the way that continental philosophers, both in France, I mean, especially Germany, but also in France and elsewhere, sort of approached political issues in this kind of indirect mediated manner, precisely because they kind of perhaps doubted their own judgment. So I hope that that sort of answers those questions.
I mean, we do have, after all, a towering figure who tried his utmost to resist fascism as a public figure, as a philosopher in Germany, and after 1945 continued in this role, somehow bringing together analytical philosophy and the continental tradition. This is Karl Jaspers. I mean, Jaspers is, from my point of view, I mean, this is one of the riddles why he never ever cottoned on in this country. I mean, this is just extraordinary. No one talks about Jaspers. I mean, despite in the States, of course, it's slightly different because we have Hannah Arendt as the prime mediator of Jaspers' thoughts in America. But in this country, Jaspers was virtually ignored. And this is something which I find remarkable, to put it mildly. But I mean, one of his studies, which somehow was shaking the public at the time, Wohin treibt die Bundesrepublik, was an extraordinary intervention of someone who was seen by and large as a most traditional thinker who interpreted Kant, etc., from Nietzsche to Strindberg and what have you. But at the same time, when push came to shove, he was there as a public figure. And I think his engagement, I wouldn't say for a minute, outweighs all the negative candidates that we can list in reply to Matthew's question. But I think Jaspers is an extraordinary example of someone who demonstrated how you can activate, as it were, analytical thought in a continental tradition and actually, propose very concrete steps when it came to where is the Federal Republic going to? And that was in the late 1950s, early 60s. But that's just an aside. Astrid Köhler's, sorry.
If I may, though, I think that Jaspers is a wonderful example. And I will say, I do think he's experiencing a little bit of a revival right now, which I hope will continue. I know a couple of people who are very invested in that. But I think that the key thing with Jaspers is very much the fact that, right, he's proposing and he's making these arguments, right, as a public intellectual. And I think that that does have directly a very large effect on sort of the way that someone like Hannah Arendt thinks, right? I mean, she actually ended up finishing her PhD with Jaspers. And also on Habermas, right, who repeatedly kind of has mentioned the kind of effect that Jaspers had on him as well. So I think that's a wonderful example. Sorry for interrupting you.
No worries at all. Thank you for that. Astrid's question, what proportion of the PPE degree is actually devoted to philosophy? Is it possible that one can only introduce future politicians to philosophy by harnessing it to practical stuff like politics and economics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm not a PPE graduate, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But initially, I can't tell you about the history of the degree. And it's interesting because I think PPE, when it was initially proposed, it was supposed to be kind of the modern counterpart to an older interdisciplinary degree program just called Greats, right, where students would read great philosophers. And it was supposed to be what was referred to in kind of, that older idiom as a modern side Greats, right? A kind of updating of Greats, focusing on contemporary or modern thinkers. What's interesting is sort of how quickly it moves away from that kind of more humanistic or historical approach towards this kind of more practical or applied approach. And initially, students were supposed to sort of devote pretty much equal time to all three degrees. Now, PPE students, I think, at least for a number of years, have been able to specialize in just two of the three, right? So just philosophy and politics, or just in politics and economics, whatever it is. And I don't think it's an accident that those kind of changes have led to the shift from focus on continental to analytic philosophy within that program. Primarily because I think sort of once you, something like analytic philosophy, which uses a lot of formal logic, it's much easier to blend that with kind of modern neoclassical economics, which is based on a lot of mathematical models. It's much easier to connect that to analytic philosophy than it is to the kind of more historical problematizing, literary or contextual approach that we see with continental philosophy. So I think that sort of there is a kind of an elective affinity, I guess we could call it, between analytic philosophy and kind of economics in the PPE degree. So, I mean, I think sort of, yeah, I think students, one of the things that draws a lot of students to PPE, aside from its prestige, is the fact that they also have a lot of freedom, a lot more freedom, I think, in picking the individual papers they write than students are usually offered in most degree programs in the UK. So I think it really varies how much actual philosophy they do. But they do at least all get an introduction to kind of the basics of the analytical method.
Just one footnote to Jaspers, if I'm forgiven. My very first PhD student, Susan Kirkbright, she wrote her dissertation on Jaspers, and her study was published by Yale on with the title, under the title Navigation of Truth. And it is very much this navigation through, shall we say, what nowadays we would say the channels of our media, of what communication is all about, that Jaspers felt strongly about. This idea that through communication, this is of course the link to Habermas, is it not? That through communication and through analyzing the preconditions, the presuppositions of communication, that you can in fact make a contribution to enhancing the sheer quality of discourses, of political discourses, philosophically, as it were, underpinned. Any further questions here? No.
Yeah, so I mean, I will make a comment on that and say that I've always, I'm very interested in kind of what I see. I mean, we talk a lot in philosophy about the linguistic turn is broader than just philosophy. Yeah. But I'm really interested in what I see as kind of this constellation of Jaspers, Arendt, and Habermas. And in particular, what I see as then building on the linguistic turn, the turn that they provide, which is kind of the turn to communication, where it's not about the formal analysis of language and grammar, but it's about sort of communication as the essence of politics. And I mean, if you move to someone like Habermas, also sort of social theory, and all kind of interaction. So I find that kind of constellation of thinkers and the links between them, both kind of historically and then philosophically, to be really interesting. And I've thought for a long time that I should that I would want to write something on the three of them and those interconnections. So maybe that's a project I'll undertake in the future.
Looking forward to it already. We have another question from Suzanne Hassel, but I can't actually see it. Jana, can you see this?
Yes, yeah, Susanne, she's actually, she said, brilliant. Do you have a platform where we can enter further conversations with you on this topic?
I don't really run a blog or anything, but my email, I'm very good with email, and it's very easy to find. There aren't very many Verovšeks out there, or Verovšeks. So yeah, if you send me an email, I'd love to keep talking about this. And yeah, I am definitely sort of, this is the stuff I'm working on now. So I'm very interested in sort of hearing feedback and other people's thoughts. So please do send me an email and I'd love to have a conversation.
Brilliant. We have quite a number of thank yous here for excellent answers to questions, etc. So Peter, I think I speak for everyone when I thank you most warmly for this wonderful presentation. And the very good news is, of course, that you will be back with us on the 11th of this month. And you will be contributing to a workshop, a center's workshop on the future of Anglo-German cultural relations, organized by our Thyssen fellow, Dr. Andrew Hines, and co-organized by our Leverhulme Fellow, Dr. David Anderson. And it will be wonderful to have you back on the 11th, and we can continue our discussions there and then. And obviously you're all cordially invited to that. So with that, thank you all very much. In particular, Peter, thank you for your excellent presentation, and until soon, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening and for your questions. And yes, I look forward to seeing everybody again on the 11th. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.